Gwen, our conversation today is all about the future of work. And if there was one thing of all of the things we're going to be talking about that you would like people to go away with, what do you think would be most valuable?
I think it's something about intentionality, being really intentional about what you're asking of your teams across the business and taking time to explain the why. So often we just say, this is what I want to happen, and we don't really help people understand the why. Secondly, enable your teams and help them work out how to do this new way of working together.
Hello. Our guest today is Gwen Stirling Wilkie, founder of Seeds of Transformation, a consulting firm home to the new Omni-Working Framework, which helps leaders and leadership teams create working environments fit for the 21st century. Gwen is a future of work expert, facing the issues of hybrid working, virtual meetings, burnout, and how to create belonging and meaningful relationships without necessarily being together. With a background in organisational transformation across charity, healthcare and corporate, Gwen has a wealth of experience to draw on. She's translated this into her work with organisations in a post-pandemic world, emphasising the importance of human-centred leadership, relationships and connection, and a safe environment to do the work in. I'm Robert Digings, and this is Highly Relational, the podcast about creating, leading, and developing great teams at work, along with all the joys and perils of exceptional and sustainable human collaboration. We have one simple aim: to help you create world-class teams, whatever your business and however you work. In our conversation today, Gwen highlights why you need to review and refresh before you can reimagine, the difference between synchronous and asynchronous work and the need to balance the two, and how people need to come together in ways they may not even have thought of before to have conversations that matter. By the end of lockdown, we were tired of Zoom game nights, Zoom calls, Zoom meetings. But now, 3 years later, hybrid working seems to be here to stay. But how well have we adapted to it? Are we really making the best use of our time by doing a meeting online? And what are the consequences for our relationships and sense of connection? Gwen thinks it's possible to have it all, and her Omni-Working Framework explains how. So I began our conversation by asking, how far away are we to successfully adapting to the new world of hybrid working, virtual meetings, and teams who have never met in person?
Things are shifting. You know, every day when I revisit this topic, there's new things that are happening, new information that's emerging, and I think we are moving closer. And of course, the more we know, the more we realise we don't know. The things that have worked, maybe they need adjusting and maybe they need tweaking, because it's all about what is right for your business. There isn't one single answer. And of course, we're in territory we've never been in before, and we can't expect people to work it out for themselves. So we have to think about enabling, we have to think about equipping, we have to think about the kind of leadership that our leadership teams need to offer organisations now.
You said we're in new territory, and we absolutely are, largely prompted by the pandemic and the fact that people weren't going into work. Where do you think we are generally? I realise there's a difference of views, of course, in a range of opinion, but where do you think we are generally around whether or not what we're trying to do is go back to how it was, as opposed to we're embracing this new thing and getting value from it? Because there was a point in time when everyone, or a lot of people, were saying, well, we just want everyone back in the office now.
Yeah, and we've still got that, that polarity of perspectives. You know, I can talk to one chief exec and they're saying, no, I need everybody back into the office. Now, I often say to them, well, what is it that you're expecting to see happen that isn't happening at the moment? And often it's about, well, this is the experience that I've always had. So there's something about our paradigm of what does it mean to work? You know, I very much hold the view that work isn't about being in a place. Work is about the outcomes that we can create. And work can nowadays be anywhere we have an internet access. That can be our place of work. So we've still got this polarisation. Other leaders I talk to go, do you know, we may not have the whole answer sorted, but we've experimented with a number of things. And for our particular business, for our particular operating circumstances, this is the arrangement that is kind of working okay for us. We might still need to tweak things, but we've learned an awful lot over the last couple of years.
And so there is a lot of hybrid working going on now, isn't there?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of companies and a lot of teams are experimenting still with how to get to that sweet spot that you're kind of alluding to, that where there isn't a prescription for it, perhaps. It's something that the team and the business has to find for themselves. And that's in some respects what Omni-Working and your book and all of the information that and the resources that you've pulled together are about supporting.
Yes, absolutely. And what we're starting to see now is more data emerging. You know, we've always got the financial performance data, but what's the data that exists about the health of our organisations? And, you know, we've got performance data now that is saying those organisations who have created a version of hybrid working or omni-working, as I call it, are now starting to outperform those that haven't, or that are being really restrictive with their mandates about where they want people to be and when they want people to be there. Now, all of that's having a knock-on effect in terms of employee engagement and also what's happening in organisations with how overwhelmed and stressed people are feeling or ill-prepared to work in a particular way, especially managers. You know, managers are feeling underprepared and overwhelmed about how they need to change their leadership and management style to work with teams who are working in all ways from all places.
And that may be part of what's driving for those who are kind of, I need people in the office. It's like, because I know how to manage and lead people when they're in front of me, as opposed to, well, how do I do it if they're spread out across the country or even around the world? Yeah.
But there's no data that I've come across that tells me working from home or working from somewhere that isn't the office is harming results. I think what's harming results is the impact on employee engagement and therefore their willingness, and also the way that organisations are enabling, whether that's through the technology, whether that's through an overarching set of guiding principles about where flexible and distributed working fits for us in our operating strategy, and how the organisation views their operating model, the internal processes and ways of working, what kind of physical office space have we got? All of those enabling pieces, which are part of the Omni-Working Framework, often don't exist in organisations, or they are trying to use exactly the same office-based approach for a working environment, which isn't about being in the office every day. So there's a mismatch.
Yes. And I know that people listening to this will also be acutely aware that there are problems and disadvantages perhaps to a virtual or hybrid way of working. And I know that you're not suggesting that that's not the case. There are things that need to be worked out. So we can talk a bit about that as well.
Absolutely.
I want to get into the actual sense of your framework so that people can get a sense of what that is. But let's just talk about relationship and how the virtual or hybrid way of working impacts teams building quality relationships with each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think even no matter where you're working, if we're working in the same physical place every day together, we still need to pay attention to how we build relationships. We still need to pay attention to the fact that it's really important to connect as human beings before we move straight into, well, what are all of the things we've got to do on our common agenda here? You know, and in some respects, it doesn't change when you're working.
Is it harder, though? Is it fair to say it's harder to do it if you're a hybrid business or a hybrid team?
I think you need to be very careful, I'm coming back to intentional, about the patterns that you build up. So there is something about there is a built-in sense of urgency that seems to come along with a virtual meeting, whether you're on Zoom or whether you're on Teams. There's almost like this kind of intensity pressure, and people feel a need to get through the agenda really, really quickly. But in terms of the topic of connection, what I often see is people just don't feel they have time to do the connection piece first. You know, if we were in a physical room, we might have a coffee together and have a bit of a chat, and then we might physically move ourselves to the table and sit down. Well, what's the equivalent of that when you're working virtually? How do you allow the time and the space for people to come together? You know, maybe for you and I to go off into a breakout room and have a little bit of a catch-up chat first. You know, that's one of the ways we can build connection in.
So it's doable. It's doable. It just happens in a different way. And then we're back to your intentional, the idea of intention being important. So we need to do the things, have some time in a breakout room before the meeting. And not rush through the agenda, kind of going, well, this somehow is a call or and we need to do it in a different way to how we might. Zoom calls can be spacious.
They can be. But you
somehow
have to,
we're wired to think that they're not.
It's weird, isn't it?
It is weird.
It's weird. But there's something about the intensity of seeing each other on camera. We're in a proximity to each other that we don't, you know, I'm not sitting like this far away from you now. And yet there is something that happens in that visual and auditory overstimulation, which I think is really important for people to work out how they need to work through that.
Nice. Let's talk specifically about the framework. Can you give us an oversight or an overview of what the Omni-Working Framework is, so that we can then, as we talk, kind of understand why you're highlighting certain things?
Yeah, and it's based on two things. Firstly, it's based on the results of a number of conversations that I had at the beginning of last year and for the first quarter of last year with many, many different business leaders. I was really curious about what had they done as we came out of the pandemic around their ways of working. What things had they tried? What had worked? And what were they still trying to figure out? So that gave me some of the really core important elements which feature in the Omni-Working Framework. The other thing was I applied my knowledge of organisation development and organisation design and design thinking to create a version of an operating model, which is what all of those 7 elements are, that says, you know, you need to pay attention to these things in a combination that is going to be unique for your organisation, but which is going to create an overarching sense of belonging where people feel included, where they feel able to contribute, where they can thrive, and where your organisation can perform. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Omni-Working Framework is all about.
And what I really loved about it when I first saw it, and I will ask you to go through the 7 things, is that it's a real... The 7 things are diverse. It isn't just about making connection or building relationship or even just about outcomes. It covers an enormous range of things that need to be given attention in this 21st century way of working. So what are the 7 elements that you've highlighted that kind of form the basis of the framework?
There's 4 of them which sit at the top of the framework, which are much more behavioural. They're much more relational. And for me, that's a really cool part of my work, as it is your work. But when we're looking at teams and how people work together across organisations, relationships, as we've talked about, need to come first. They're like the bedrock, really. And so the framework looks at cultivating connections. Now, that's the way that we build those particular relationships, either within teams, through our social capital, our bonding social capital. And that's how we bring people together. That's how we get team cohesion. And during the pandemic, that was a really strong focus about how to keep people motivated and connected. The other part of social capital, which is included in cultivating connections, is about our bridging connection. That might be how we work with different cross-functional teams, or how we also look and build connections and networks outside of our organisation, because that's often where our source of innovation comes from. What are we seeing going on in the outside world that could be really helpful for us? It might be a trend. It might be something that is going on which is affecting our potential customers and clients. How do we bring that in?
Continue going through the 7 elements. You've covered. You said there were 4 that were to do with relationship or
relationships
human
and behaviours.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned connections and relationships. And what else is in that section of the framework?
The other section of that top half of the framework is about optimising working practices. And that's really about How do we do the simple everyday things like making choices about running meetings, how we run a meeting, how we may optimise our own personal working environment? When's the best time of the day for me to do particular kinds of work? When am I going to collaborate with my colleagues? So those working practices there's a lot of opportunity in there for us as individuals and teams and organisations to really look at all of our ways of working. And then the final one in the top half of the framework is about outcomes. We've historically been very focused on measuring this thing called productivity, which is often more about inputs than it is about the outcomes and the results that we produce. And I think, again, this for me is one of the big shifts as a result of the pandemic. Focus more on outcomes, and then you'll find out where people are really contributing and adding value. And we can move away from this debate about, well, when people are in the office, I know they're working. Well, you know they're being visible, but not necessarily that they are doing what you need them to do as part of their role and contribution to the organisation.
And really, that focus on outcome ought to have been in place anyway. But of course, in some respects, it's like, well, why are we bothering about presenteeism or who's here?
Yeah.
Business is about outcome, isn't it?
It is.
That's the reason that businesses exist.
It is, but what we haven't yet done very well is actually work out what are the signals of progress that tell me I can be comfortable that my team are delivering what I need them to deliver. And we often get hooked up in, well, has Robert attended all of the meetings I want him to attend? How much is he contributing? How quickly does he respond to emails? How often do I see his little green light on, which tells me he's there and available? And those are all signals of activity, but not necessarily outcomes.
So they're the first four elements of the framework, and they're about relationships and behaviours. And the four elements were relationships, connections, working practices, and outcomes. What remains? What are the other elements?
The others are what I call the enablers, the omni-enablers. One of those is creating guiding principles. And that's the overarching belief in the organisation about where flexibility and distributed working sits. I tend not to call it hybrid working because I think it's got so many different connotations around it. So
just to be clear, is this principles about the omni-working and how we're going to do it, or is it principles that are far more reaching than that?
They're far more reaching than that. And one of the organisations that I think does this incredibly well is a software organisation called Atlassian. They have guiding principles. Team Anywhere means that they want to be able to recruit talent from anywhere, that they want people to be able to work wherever suits the work that they are doing. Now, that's a really high overarching guiding principle. And they also recognise that connection is important, so they want to come together, but with intent and with purpose. So that, for me, is a beautiful set of guiding principles.
And here, in what you've just articulated, is one of the huge advantages of this way of working.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's being driven by what the outcomes are, not by the idea that we're going to build a big office in this particular part of the world.
Yes. And they still have offices, And in Omni-Working, I'm not saying that the office shouldn't be there. It's just becoming another place that work gets done, not the central place that work happens. And that moves really nicely onto the second of the enablers, which is about working spaces. So what are the working spaces that we have for the kind of work we need to do? Sometimes we need to really be able to focus, get our head down, real concentrated work. Now, for some people, doing that in the office actually is the right place for them because maybe their living arrangements or their home arrangements mean that they haven't got a quiet space. For others, it's a space away from an office, in a quiet space at home, or maybe in a quiet public space like a library or somewhere like that. But we need to have space where we can concentrate uninterrupted. We then need to have space where we do what I call our coordinating work. It might be answering emails, it might be checking in with people, it might be doing a little bit of planning and coordinating with other people. And that kind of space can be a mix of somewhere which is a bit noisy and sociable and somewhere a little bit quiet. So an office environment actually might be really helpful for that, or a coffee shop, or again, from your space at home. The third kind of space, and I think this is where this bit gets really interesting, that's our generative and collaborative space. Now, we can either do that all together, which might be all together on a virtual meeting, or it might be all together in a physical space. And that space needs to be set up in a way that we can generate ideas, we can capture things, and we may then need to have a space which is quite flexible in how it's set up, and we can rearrange it in many different ways. And then the fourth kind of space we need is when we all come together as a bigger team or as a wider function or a wider organisation, depending on the size and scale of the business that you're in. And that's a very different kind of space. So it might be that your office environment is big enough to accommodate a big meeting and community gathering, or it may be that you need to go and do that in a different location completely. But these kinds of spaces are the spaces that we need. And of course, we mustn't forget our digital workspace, because that's hugely important. Being able to configure a digital workspace, which we can literally take everywhere with us in our ability to be able to do great work in all ways from all places.
These enablers are so key, aren't they? Because there's no point going, well, we're worried that the connection or the relationships are not as good as they were, or that we're struggling with this without actually paying attention to, well, what will facilitate, what will enable these things to happen that we value in a different working environment or a different working practice.
Yeah. And the final one around technology, I alluded to it in terms of a digital workspace, but also, how is the organisation embracing technology, generative AI, automation, and how does that get built into the other changes that are happening around people's multi-stage life, around different generations coming into the workforce, and we're managing 4, soon to be 5 different generations in that workforce. And how does technology enable us to do that in the right way? We can't do it in isolation. And I think so often the debate is about the where, not the how. And I think the how is the way to unlock some of the challenges that businesses are facing. But it's not easy, because there isn't a straightforward answer. You have to work it out in the right way for your organisation.
And of course, what happened in the pandemic was that it wasn't something that was planned. It kind of almost changed, not quite overnight, but almost.
Pretty much.
Where everybody was like, well, how are we even going to talk to one another? There's this thing called Zoom. It's like, so piling into Zoom and then and all of what that entailed.
Yes. And I think there is unlearning to do, because I think we adapted incredibly well. And embraced everything that was thrown at us.
Well, we had no, in some respect, I think you're right, but we also had no choice.
Yeah.
It was like, this is what has to happen.
Yeah. And then, of course, coming out of the pandemic, then we start to need to make choices again. Hence my conversations with all of these leaders in organisations to say, help me understand the choices you are making and what is it that you're still trying to work out. So how do we simplify? And for me, one of the ways that I encourage teams to do that is to create a team agreement. So we might have the overarching guiding principles, but then that says at a team level, you have autonomy and choice to create a team level working environment that is fit for purpose for your team. And yet, if we have too much, we get overwhelmed. So the guiding principles create some kind of guardrails and boundary. And within that, there's your freedom to act. And as a team and as a senior leader of a team, then bringing your team together to work out how are we going to use our time most effectively to deliver the outcomes that this team needs to deliver. How often do we need to meet in person to build a rhythm? Because by connecting in person, we know, again, Atlassian have created the first 1,000 days of distributed working, brilliant report which came out a couple of weeks ago, talking about the bounce effect in terms of commitment, connection and collaboration that they get from coming together physically in person every quarter. They can see it, they're tracking it. So they're doing some great experiment mapping.
In all cases in our lives and at work, we learn from others. And so that kind of undertaking where another organisation, and I imagine you've got many examples where different organisations are doing a piece of this brilliantly because they've got the resources or the expertise to apply and kind of go, well, we need to solve this part of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
And the framework that you've created kind of shows what the whole might look like, or what the elements are that, as you said earlier, need attention. And through intention, there is this intentionality.
Yes. And you can't, if you just focus on one, then actually you're not going to get a solution that works for your organisation. You're going to get something which is a little unbalanced. So you need to pay attention to things that happen in all of those elements.
A little bit earlier, you said meetings.
Yes.
And of course, in some of what you've just described within the framework about working spaces and principles and relationships, there are a lot of meetings happening.
There are.
People might even be listening to this right now in a meeting. Who knows? What are some of the things that you've come to understand about meetings and what works in this new way of working and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think we got into one of the bad habits that has come out is we are now obsessed about, I'll just put a quick meeting into your diary, and I have this thing about, does this really need to be a meeting? Could it be something that can be communicated out through the team channel? Again, this is absolutely the territory of creating a team agreement. What gets communicated out through our team channel, whether that's on Slack, whether it's on Asana, whether it's on Team, whatever the platform you use to do that, what can just be communicated? When we're coming together for a meeting, what's the purpose of the meeting? What is this meeting about? If it's about sharing information, you don't need a meeting for that. You can do that in other ways. If it's about making a decision, you may need a meeting, but you may not need everybody in the meeting. If it's about generating solutions, exploring a challenge that the business or the team is facing, that's a really good thing to have a meeting for. So there's this element of which I talk about in the book about synchronous working and asynchronous working. And I think this is one of the big things that, one, can free up people's time being in less meetings, and two, is one of the big areas that we can create much more space for people and time to do the work that we seem to find ourselves in meetings talking about the work we need to do, but we can't do the work we need to do because we're in a meeting talking about it. So it creates more time.
Let's just unpack a little bit about this synchronous and asynchronous. It's a beautiful distinction, and I totally get it. In a real world meeting, the conversation is synchronous because it's like the conversation we are having right now in this studio.
Yeah.
Asynchronous conversations are happening. We're all used to them because we do them on email, we do them on text, we do them on WhatsApp, we do them via letters even.
Yes.
And postcards, if we go back to the last century. How does a team or a leader or a meeting convener make the distinction, make the decision that this needs to be synchronous time or asynchronous time?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the first things that leaders need to get their head around, and it will require a little bit of an experimentation. So for me, when I'm bringing people together physically for a meeting, I want that to be as productive as possible. I want us to spend that time doing the really valuable stuff that is building on each other's ideas, generating ideas, which is the really important collaborative time. Beforehand, I want people to do some preparation so they come ready for what I call active participation. So it's decoupling. And this was something which was really big during the pandemic and featured in the first book that I wrote about running everything virtually and online, is decoupling. How do we prepare people for active participation? What do they need to have read beforehand? What do they need to have done some thinking about beforehand? What do they need to go and talk to other people about beforehand to canvass opinion, to get view, to get data, to get information? So when we all come together, it's really highly focused, highly productive time. And for me, that's one of the easiest ways to ease into this bit about what needs to be done synchronously and what needs to be done asynchronously. Then you've got that wrapped around that other forms of communication. Whether that might be what do I need to transmit out to my team and what's my channel for doing that? Where do we need to explore and just update each other with what's going on? I need a little bit of help on this. Has anybody got any time today? So how do we do that sort of day-to-day communication? And I also encourage teams to have what I call open collaboration time scheduled into their diaries. It doesn't mean that we're going to spend that time on a call together, but it says, Robert, every day this week between 10 and 12, I'm available. I'm doing other stuff, but if you want to chat, I'm here and I'm available. In the afternoons, actually, that's my focus time. I need to prepare a report. I need to pull a presentation together. And so I'm not available for casual interruption during that period of time. And that's another thing which just helps think about what do I need to do synchronously? What do I need to do asynchronously?
Let's talk a little bit about teams, because this podcast is very much about creating amazing teams. What can teams do that is just for them, as opposed to what the organisation might be placing around them or deciding for the whole of the organisation? Where is the distinction between what the organisation needs to do for everybody and what an intact team needs to do, whether it's 6 people or 60 people, for themselves?
I think firstly is spending the time together to have alignment with what the team is there for. So that internal team relationship building, connection building, because we know that that's one of the first elements of high performance. You know, I talk a lot about high performance flexibility. Well, at a team level, you know, if you don't have the trusted relationship there, if you haven't spent the time building an understanding of each other, then no matter what work you're doing, you're never going to get the best out of everybody. So how do we create spaces for people to be able to bring their best? For some of us who like to talk a lot, meetings are brilliant. For others who do their best work in that deep thinking space, asking them on the spot to come up with an idea is not the best way for you to bring the best out of them. So that understanding of relationships first, creating those team agreements, which is almost like our team shorthand for this is how we want to work together. And being clearly aligned with how does our team contribute to the overall organisation. So there is an element of what my team needs to do, and then there is an element of, as the leader of that team, how do I enable my team to do that work which connects us to other parts of the organisation, because we're never there in isolation. So it's always that balance.
It's complex though, isn't it?
It is.
Especially as the size of the business increases and if it's multiple locations around the country or around the world, these conversations, this redesigning is not something that is necessarily easy to do or quick to do or that necessarily everyone has the expertise to do.
Yeah.
Is there a requirement or a need for specialists to come together to look at this, or is it something that in fact any team can do with a little bit of help and a bit of thought?
Some organisations do have somebody who looks at flexible and distributed working. So, you know, I'll come back to Atlassian. You know, they have somebody who heads up Team Anywhere, and that's their full-time job, to be able to create an organisation and a culture which is built around distributed working. So for some people, it might be a role. My hesitation with something being a role is somebody goes, oh, well, that's their responsibility, not mine. So I think there's something for me about organisational leadership being equipped with some of the fundamental skills that underpin my practice of Dialogic OD, which is about how do we bring people together for conversations that matter, that help us move our work forward. So I think there's something about how do we skill and equip leaders to work in this way. What's the internal support? So do they have an internal team of, it might be come through the HRBP function. It might come through a team of organisational effectiveness specialists. They might have an organisation development function. And then there's another option then of bringing that expertise in from the outside. And when I go in to do work like that in organisations, one of the things that I'm always doing is thinking about how do I equip these leaders to be able to do this without me? And so the work I'm doing on Omni-Working at the moment is how do I skill up these leaders to look at these different elements, to think about them all, and to identify what needs doing in their team and in their organisation, build some skill and capability, and then get out of the way and let them do it for themselves.
Yes, and in the short term, for organisations that have the budget, bringing in consultants like yourself to help is a really effective way of moving the dial rapidly and getting expertise into the business fast. And I guess there's a lead time. You talked about leadership development or how the expertise of leadership. Over time, this kind of thing, and maybe it's already happening, you can tell me, will be built into leadership development programs, MBAs even. It will become just the norm that this is something that is part of leadership expertise, as opposed to leaders now, perhaps, who did their MBA maybe 5 or 10 years ago, perhaps feeling they're not currently equipped to face into all of the different opportunities and challenges that your framework identifies.
Yes, and I think there's two things in there. Firstly is how leaders and managers are being equipped internally. And I think there is a gap about what's being expected from leaders and managers now and the way that they are being supported and developed. And that doesn't mean sending them out on a training course because developmental work and skills development can be done very much alongside their work. So making the work that they're doing the focus of the development. So that's the first piece. I think the second piece is, again, we've also got a gap at the sort of the more formal learning stage around MBAs. And it's interesting because I'm in conversation with a number of universities at the moment about what are they doing to equip their MBA students, their MSc students about the future of work. How to design and shape the future of work and what do they need to think about when they go back to organisations. So for me, it's still an area which is catching up, but I don't think has done enough yet.
So let me ask you a kind of devil's advocate question. Imagine somebody listening to us now goes, totally get everything that you've just said. I can see that it requires a lot of thought, a lot of time, intentionality around at least the 7 elements to your framework, if not more. Because of that, it's time consuming and costly. So why can't we just all go back to the office?
Well, my response is what's happening with your business results? That's the first thing. What's happening with your relational data, employee engagement, attracting the talent you want, losing people you don't want to lose, your manager's ability to be able to cope with what's going on, and what is your data telling you? Because there's going to become some choice points. And there are some organisations that are bringing everybody back into the office that at the moment are performing. And they're starting to see it fragmenting at the edges. Their employee engagement scores are dipping off. They're finding it harder to attract talent. People now aren't interested in organisations that want people back in the office, that don't have a flexible working policy. You know, flexible working isn't new, but it's being adapted for this environment.
Well, and it's also being scaled up. So
yes.
It may not be new, but it's certainly happening at a level that's never been seen before.
Yes. So the pandemic accelerated something which had started to be built up over the last 10 or 15 years, and it just accelerated it and has made everybody go, whoa, now we really need to rethink about work and the place that work has in our lives.
Would you go as far to say that is something to be celebrated, that it's a great, I mean, it was a dreadful thing when it happened. We were caught out and there were all sorts of other consequences to do with illness that are and were tragic and terrible.
Yes.
But if we just look at the impact on work, would you say now that this is all for the better? That this is unlocked potential, or are we actually just solving? Or the alternative could be, if we had in a black and white world, that it's awful, and we're just having to solve a problem.
I view on it as it's a huge benefit. It's a massive opportunity. And when you look at the ability for people who may have felt excluded from working environments, we know that women are getting access to better roles because of flexibility options, because they're able to manage the rest of the things that are going on in their lives. We know that male and other caring partners are getting more involved in families. We know that for people who have neurodivergent challenges about going into a workplace, they're finding. So the diversity and inclusion that we're getting now that we weren't getting before the pandemic has to be a benefit. We're getting different insights, we're getting different thinking, we're getting different creativity. That has to be better for us. Yes, it's challenging. And no, there isn't one single right answer. But I think we have a responsibility as leaders of organisations to embrace a change which is only going to continue to accelerate when we now start to think about generative AI and automation. It's bringing on another wave of considerations for leaders in organisations.
Would it be true to say, am I right in saying that the dust has at least settled now? Now at least we've got the space to think about this properly and to do it in a considered and maybe more planned way than we did 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah. I think we've been in I don't know, what I would call triaging emergency mode. We've had to cope. We've had to kind of respond to whatever's going on and make the best choices we could at that particular point in time.
Is that over? Do you think we're out of that now, or is that still...
It feels like we are out of it. And I think you're right. It feels like the dust has settled a bit. Things are still kind of a bit uncertain, but we are now in that point in time where I really encourage leaders to go, okay, just check out, where are you? How is it going really? Not necessarily based on what your own personal preferences are, but how's it going? How's your organisation performing against expectation? How's your organisation performing against the rest of the marketplace? What else is going on out there that's going to be driving a need? What's happening with your retention, engagement, attraction from your human potential perspective? And then start to make some choices. And omni-working can be embraced at an individual level. So I encourage everybody to go, take a look at yourself against each of these 7 elements. How do you set yourself up for success? And what adjustments can you take? You don't need anybody's permission to do the work on yourself. You don't need anybody's permission to improve a relationship with a colleague. Then look at it from a team perspective. And then if it's part of your role, because some people's roles are about setting the strategic intent and the strategic direction for the organisation, looking at flexibility as a competitive advantage, about what does our operating model need to look like and what changes do we need to make to be successful. For some leaders, it's about how do I operationalise and make it work for my team based on decisions that have been made by others. So you've got 2 really important aspects of that. And we know that those organisations who view flexible and distributed working, or omni-working as I call it, as a source of competitive advantage will make decisions in a different way. They'll behave in a different way, and the employee experience will be really different compared to an organisation who views flexible and distributed working as an HR benefit or perk. That drives a whole different set of decisions and a whole different employee experience.
And what I love, Gwen, about what you've just said and the energy with which you've expressed it is the opportunity here and the sense of reimagining work. Not as a response or a reaction to the pandemic, but just as a exercise in itself. But what do What do leaders need to bear in mind if they're going to approach it as a piece of reimagining? What information do they need? Where do they need to start rather than possibly for those who are highly ambitious and creative, a blank sheet of paper could be the answer. But for many, it wouldn't be. A blank sheet of paper would be too scary, too frightening. So what is the process that you think is, or that you would recommend, or that you would encourage a leader to do if they did want to reimagine their business and the way that they are asking their colleagues to work?
And for me, I think it's part of the expectation of senior leadership, that at some point in time you pause and you go, okay, what's going on? It might be part of an annual strategy setting process or a budgeting process, but actually it's really good leadership organisational practice. So I think firstly, look at the data, both financial, behavioural and relational. I think secondly, involve people. Become curious. Think of your role as a really curious explorer. What's actually happening? And how are my own assumptions and beliefs about this organisation and what ought to be present? How much of those beliefs and assumptions need to be challenged? And the only way I can do that is by talking to other people, and not just my normal group of people who I might talk to as part of a senior team, people in different parts of the organisation. We have so much more organisational wisdom than we give ourselves credit for. And how do we tap into that? So be curious, involve others. Don't feel that you need to have the right answer. And also focus on outcomes. I'm coming back to outcomes. I'm coming back to intentionality. And how do I shift my mindset as a leader from leading to enabling? And I think for me, that's one of the big leadership shifts that's going on alongside everything else that we're trying to juggle.
It's been fantastic talking to you today. There is such a richness in the all of the work that you've done in pulling together Omni-Working, and there's a lot of information available through your website and the book, of course, which I'll come to before the programme finishes. Just in the last few minutes, what would your counsel be to somebody listening to this who goes, yes, I'd love to do something, maybe not a huge thing, but I'd like to bring to life some of the things that you've been highlighting with us today, Gwen, maybe with my team, maybe for myself, maybe at the next offsite or company conference even. Where could an individual start in this journey?
Yeah, I think my first encouragement is to just get started. And I think the most simple thing to do is to look at yourself. I've created a really simple online tool called the Omni-Working Profile. And it's available through the website. And that's just a really simple way for people to get started. Do it, encourage others to do it, have a conversation about it and see what happens.
Gwen, it's been a delight to talk to you today. Thank you for sharing some of your expertise around this. I know we've probably only just touched the surface, but there are all sorts of things that you've brought to our conversation today that I know will be of great interest and value to those listening. So thank you so much for coming into the studio today and being with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
The Omni-Working Gwen Stirling Wilkie, thank you for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. To find out more about Gwen's work, head to seedsoftransformation.co.uk and omni-working.com. And check out her most recent book, Omni-Working, Work Effectively in All Ways, From All Places, published by the Academy for Relationships. You've been listening to Highly Relational. Check out the show notes for more information about today's guest and the topics covered. We do hope you're enjoying these conversations and getting value from them. Do let us know what you think wherever you're listening or watching, and feel free to follow me on LinkedIn to join in the online conversation. And of course, there's no better way to support what we're doing than by reviewing and subscribing. The podcasting algorithm is very partial to a subscription snack. I'd like to thank today's studio engineer at VoxPod Studios, Alex Bennett. Post-production is by Sean Lawson, and the series producer is Ella Halsell. I'm Robert Digings. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.